现在我们要进行今天第3场座谈，主题是反博物馆学。有请本场次的主持人丁颖英策展人上台引言。
Good afternoon, everyone. In this section, the speakers is Sabih Ahmed, the director of Ishara Art Foundations. He is a curator and cultural theorist. His curatorial practices steep in interdisciplinary thinking that bridges languages and technology, geographies and movement, art archive, and also histories. His presentations is against museology. That is a rather provocative proclamation that challenges us to reconsider the purposes and relevance of museums in our own cultural context. Considering the recent development of museologies, many of us in the museums world passionately advocating that museums should make changes and it should be critical platforms that engages communities, negotiating differences and creating meanings and values of art and cultures for wide ranges of people. In view of this, Sabih's presentation serves as an intellectual exercise that opens up discussions about why museum matters, or perhaps not. How we can reinvent the cultural institutions that accommodate diverse needs of our communities. We are also excited in this panel to have Professor Manray shows as the respondent. Manray's curators and art critics with extensive experiences in curating biennials among many artist projects. His intellectual work focuses on cultural conditions of globalizations and geopolitics of contemporary arts. Manray seems skeptical of some of the proposals put forward by Sabih. And so it would be extremely interesting to hear his insight into unraveling the complexities of museologies and how it matters to all of us. Unfortunately, today's Sabih cannot physically join us. Instead, he provided a pre-recorded presentations. So please join me in welcoming Sabih's presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so sorry I couldn't join all of you today, and I know how much I'm going to be missing because of my absence. Before I begin my paper, I want to specially thank everyone at CIT 24 and Amy Cheng and UGA for being so supportive throughout the process of putting this together. And it is certainly a very urgent subject that we should all be coming together for. And I hope I'll do some justice to the other presentations and to the conversations that are taking place. Let me just share my screen as I begin. My paper is titled Against Museology, and I'm going to preface my paper with a quick note on crisis. The crisis that seems to have become an all-prevailing narrative should make us ask one question: who is profiting from them? This is because the crises we're experiencing are not happenstance, they're not out of control, they're not totalizing, and they're not complicated. They are triggered, calibrated, managed in order to meet goals of certain ideologies and the people who benefit from them. They also deploy new techniques, instruments, and figures and vocabularies while reorienting older ones. So the question really is, how do we perceive all of this? Just as an instance, we know how deployment of the term climate change softens the cataclysmic impact and the injustices that it brings in its wake. Just as climate crisis demands climate justice, we must look at social, political, economic, and cultural crises to demand social, political, economic, and cultural justice. What does cultural justice look like? Some of the above crises and demands for justice also translate into the recent history of museums and the art industry. And I'm deliberately using the term industry and not field, which I will talk about later. By recent, of course, I mean as recent as the pandemic in 2020 that a lot of people have been presenting on. In 2020, as the pandemic unfolded, Andres Santos's book on the future of museums came out. A year later, he elaborated on the expanded function of the museum today, a space for the community, collective knowledge, and so on. And in a way, his book pretty well summarizes a whole lot of discussions that have been happening around the museum complex at large. But in the same 2 years, the most prominent news coming from museums was the layoff of hundreds of museum staff, where the education teams were the first ones to be furloughed. I'm only highlighting a few examples in my presentation today. If anyone's interested in a longer list, do let me know, because my friend and former colleague Sabih and I have been compiling this for some time now. The question that rings on my mind, having seen all of this, is if knowledge, education, community building, and social engagement had been so central to museums leading up to the pandemic, whatever happened to that mandate? How is it that the very people who led those educational initiatives became the most easily dispensable? Thereafter, what we are seeing is an even more precaritization of museum positions. I remember Bernard Stiegler used to talk about the proletarianization of society, where I think there's something to be said about society being made and pushed into more and more precarious conditions of life. In museum positions, more precisely, one can see more short-term hires, less benefits for staff, huge salary gaps between upper and lower management, between consultants and employees, a constant shortage of funding, more bureaucratization and managerialization of curatorial roles, where curators primarily become responsible as managers, as fundraisers, as administrators, rather than as intellectuals. All of these are a 101 pattern of privatization, where states and governments slowly outsource infrastructural responsibility onto private firms and private models of work, who first make big promises and then hold society hostage to new schemes that require more money to avert an endless crisis. So I start my paper with my first formulation that underpins most of my presentation today. And that is, to develop strategies to decolonize the museum, we will have to come up with strategies to decapitalize the museum. Now, what do I mean by this? As much as progress is being made in the directions of what Charles Esche advocated to decolonize, demodernize, and decentralize the museum, not to mention the efforts to bring minor and indigenous voices into the museum complex, the question of decolonization fundamentally falls back on decapitalization. And this is especially urgent as the most pressing agenda for most public and private museums seems to be raising money to build a new wing, acquire new artwork, and entertain their funders. When sharing this formulation on decapitalizing the museum in other forums in the past, I've often been asked, does this mean defunding the museum? But that suggests a rather narrow idea of capital. By decapitalize, I mean to question the extractive, necropolitical techniques of subjugation, domination, and quantification that lie at the heart of colonialism and capitalism. Sven Lindqvist, the famous anthropologist, had showed how the history of enlightenment was founded on a paradigm of civilization, colonization, and extermination. Annihilation was the very foundation of the civilizing mission. Other writers have talked about how it wasn't just a history of genocide, but a history of omnicides, meaning that it was basically a wipeout or an extermination of all forms of species that happened as part of the larger colonial conquests. And imagine if, when we are looking at the foundations of this emancipatory project of enlightenment, the very institutions that uphold those values obviously come to mind. So what can the decapitalization of the museum and of culture look like? And what does artistic, curatorial, and academic thought offer towards imagining and realizing this? Instead of focusing on museums per se, I feel we might want to focus on the museological and outline What is the new regime within which the museum, the academy, the archive, the classroom, even public spaces operate in the neoliberal era? This new regime reprograms the museum, its functionaries, its instruments, its technologies and techniques, and most importantly, the limits of what we want to expect from it. The functionaries include figures such as the manager, the art advisor, the consultant, and a frenzy to privatize the museum and all the art that goes inside it. The most important point I hope my presentation is able to press is not to illustrate the total capture of the artist, the curator, or the curatorial within this new regime, but to mark a differentiation of the curatorial from the museological, and therefore to establish a difference between the art field and the art industry. After all, there will always be curators who police, who are custodians, caretakers, etc., of an inherited legacy that actually thrives on inequality. And then there are curators who smuggle, as Erich Prokop would say. So, who are the police and who are smuggling? The following sections in my presentation are in 5 parts, and they're co-written with my friend and artist Lantincier for a book that we brought out last year titled Mass Traffic. It was published by Kunsthal Bern and Moose Publishing, and accompanied by the generous intellectual companionship of several friends and interlocutors, of whom Cabello Malazzi holds a very important place, so thank you to her. While my presentation won't have solutions on how the curatorial navigates various crises that we're all discussing today, I do hope to outline a problem that is right among us. Not the symptoms of the problem, but the root causes of it. And in the end, to share instances of where I see exuberant possibilities. Section 1, Against Museology. The history of curating has to be rewritten, abandoning the etymology of care. We know that every conference refers back to how curating comes from the word care. And let's not forget that. Of course, let's not forget it. But I think something more needs to be done. Because the care for objects, the way we're looking at institutions and museums and private museums more and more, is not actually a care for objects, it's an asset management. The care for knowledge is not care, it's a preservation of power. The care for history is not care, it's a question of who writes the future. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the museum discourse would have us believe that the curatorial is subservient to the legacy of collection building and custodianship. However, while every museum is a collection, every collection is not a museum. While every museum has a curator, every curator is not a museum curator. And that's why I think it's very important, maybe in today's time, to differentiate between the curatorial and the museological. We know already that the legacy of the exhibition, or all kinds of exhibitions since the 19th century, often come with a two-pronged genealogy, one going back to museums and the other to world fairs, that is, the museological and the mercantile. In curatorial studies, these two legacies are often kept separate, translating into the separation of the hallowed sphere of knowledge and the necessary perils of the marketplace. In the 21st century, we're yet again witnessing how the museological and the mercantile are becoming one and the same. Rarely will you see so many museum directors and curators congregate in one place than in an art fair or at a collector's home. But of course, there's a difference between the museum and the market as well, which is, on the one hand, in the display tactic, for instance, but more importantly, they maintain different maturity periods for returns on investments. In turn, there's an intensification in the deployment of the curatorial towards a common goal, that is, to create, maintain, and preserve a commodity aesthetic. Commodity aesthetics, I would say, is a regime that produces and perceives the world through a management of objects. One could call it a system of objects, as Jean Baudrillard did, but we will not even call it that. It is a management of the historical object, the contemporary object, the art object, the functional object, the virtual object, the object of knowledge, the object of desire, the lost object and the found object, a valuable object, the invaluable object, a man-made object, a natural object, and so on. This object is an asset, a resource, a property requiring a rightful owner, and a system that ensures a naturalization of ownership. However, Objects are not objects. They are brawl clouds. They are sites, processes, currencies, prostheses, phantoms, occurrences, incidents, events, mediums like talismans and omens, and fields for processes, the processes of a world that is made of organs, machines, biosystems, metabolisms, transmissions, combustion, and regeneration. Processes that make ecosystems, not economic systems. If you want an example of how the infinitely complex universe of entities is deadened into objects, take Albert Einstein's brain that was dissected into 240 blocks, and 46 of which are in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. Think of a reliquary of figures from Gabon and masks from Dan people from the Ivory Coast that were in the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadero, which was built in conjunction with Paris's World Fairs in 1878 and which inspired Picasso. Think of all the worldly paintings in public and private collections today. You can see the deadening of practices into objects. The museological and the mercantile both try to simulate an ecosystem, but that ecosystem is an economic system, both financial and symbolic, that consolidates the world as a catalog of objects, arranged into dioramas that take the form of museums and art fairs. Both of these entities fear transformation. Both of these entities encourage consumption and reproduction. According to both, everything is at the risk of vanishing either literally or in value. The museological and the mercantile both project the delusion that by preserving objects, the world's history, traditions, and cultures can be protected from vanishing. Both fear the risk of everything transforming. The museological is where any transformation of the object is regarded as a loss or a deterioration. Therefore, condition reports, insurance policies, contracts of ownership, and contracts that state that an artist cannot revisit their own work, entire edifices are erected to protect transformations from happening. But when does transformation begin to signify loss, and when does loss become a problem? This is why the museological would like to give the impression that in the museum, time can be made to stand still, and entropy can be made to slow down. But to make time stand still is less a protection of objects and culture and more a preserving of the power already accumulated through the conjoined histories of the museum and the market. As the late David Graeber would say, and I quote, "One should never underestimate the power of institutions to preserve themselves at all costs," unquote. The control of time, in this instance, is not a claim over the complexities of time. It is a claim over who controls whose time. That is, who has control over others' time, and who can accumulate others' time to save their own. Who can have more leisure time by enslaving others? Who can create faster machines by extracting resources? Who has the power to make who wait? There is a museum in Zanzibar, set up in the building that was once a bureaucratic and administrative office for the sale and purchase of enslaved people. The museum tells the violent history of slavery in East African colonies. Inside it, there are only text panels on sunboards mounted on emptied administrative wall buildings. There are no objects, no archives, documents, or relics. At first, one questions, how this is a museum if there is not a single object in it? Walking from one room to another, it slowly dawns on the visitor that this museum is not to be seen in isolation as a fortress made vacant, but rather as an inverted image of the stockpile of artifacts spread across London, Paris, New York, etc., etc. The museological produces time as a scarcity. The scarcity is translated through the museological artifact, eulogized for being the last remaining fossil, the only mask to be found, the few bodily remains available, the absolute quintessential commodity. Finally, who becomes the custodian of history? The caretaker of the said scarce commodity. This is how the museological produces a mediation that pretends to be unmediated. It narrates the originary context the history and the story of the scarce commodity in lieu of the vanished site, the vanquished community, and the unretrievable time. The museological resists any other form of intelligibility, fetishizing all disintegrations that appear in the form of ruin and residue. However, everything is constantly disintegrating and forming new integrations. The museological produces a paranoia around reintegration. Reintegration threatens to lose intelligibility and context. Therefore, the museological produces an epistemological barricade around the collection. If the museum is a fortress, the museological is an aura of fear, fear of disappearance, of transformation, of movement, and of life. Death is not only a biological death, a social death, or taking away of sovereignty of an individual. Death is also a killing of relationality, of the relations. Within the neoliberal era, and now a techno-feudal context that a lot of economists describe the present time as, this gets intricately connected with Achille Mbembe's formulation on borders and the fantasy of total security, of perfectly controlled barricades. Mbembe urges us to think of the border as an institution. The spatial calibration of borders to control how living and non-living masses can move, transform, translate is policed to the T at a planetary scale. Think of literally every detail in the museum architecture, from fixing objects in vitrines to fixing their history and meanings and labels and reports and provenance, to the procedural instruments of paperwork, to the entire military complex at their disposal, to ever-intensifying risk management. Section 2, the manager. So the manager is one of the functionaries of the problem. And I don't mean just the manager, but also the managerialization of culture. The work of the manager is a deadening force. It is the work of police. The work of managers will be complete when all life ceases to be. Over the past 2 decades, there has been a rapid managerialization of culture, a culture of management. This culture advocates a fantasy that to be well organized means one has to have good managerial skills. This puts forth a number of underlying assumptions that are full of contradictions, but nevertheless include the following. Life is disorganized, therefore one needs to actively organize one's life and one's affairs. Point number 2, make a list, put down your thoughts and have a good plan, preferably in bullet points, concise, focused, efficient, effective, and economical. To be disorganized is chaos, and chaos is dangerous. To be organized, next point, suggests reliability, efficiency, good character, longevity, morality. Next point, but if you organize people, that too can be dangerous. Last point, so life can be a danger to itself if it is not managed. To organize things has always been around, but that is not the same as management. The idea of management appears as a gradual and insidious force that does not even need the figure of the manager to begin with. It is a force that makes its way into culture through techniques, instruments, tips, formal instructions, guidelines, and diagrams. Since the beginning of industrialization and its focus on mass production, managerial solutions were developed such as discretization of labor, standardization of processes, quality control, workflow planning, and rudimentary accounting. It is with this demand that entire industries were set up to formalize managerialism through a combination of softwares, aftershaves, ties, other cosmetic products, business cards, self-help literature, and motivational speaker events. Since the 2000s, this formalization evolved into a seamless naturalization of managerialism as culture itself, a managerial slide. Here, the statistical and ballistic insights are imported from military operations, headquarters. Like, think of just the terms, headquarters, plan of action, point of contact, impact, strategy, acronyms, more acronyms, and many more acronyms, informing the basis of a field that would subsequently form vast operations of supply chains. This produces a curious naturalization of both managerialism and militarism into culture. In workplaces, the transition is marked by the shift from cabins and cubicles to campuses and open layouts. Cabins and cubicles are now moved to the back or outsourced to some other country. The manager believes that the entire world is operating through Microsoft Office. Microsoft Office was designed for the manager. Managers frown upon those who do not know how to use Word, PowerPoint, SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, Outlook, and especially Microsoft Excel. The managers are unable to understand how anyone could function without these. They frown even more upon those who do not use these softwares the way managers do. If they're generous, they will smirk upon this lack of knowledge in a patronizing way. This is the morality of the manager. A manager thinks that everyone aspires to be a manager because everything needs management. But the manager knows that only a good manager can be a manager, so everyone else must work for the manager. A manager does not understand why someone would not want to become a manager. Nothing pleases a manager more than to see a beautiful spreadsheet, an impressive table, a well-organized desk, neatly combed information, presentable fonts, a glossy presentation, and all loose ends tied. The manager has a knack for uniformity, same-size fonts, few colors, center alignment or left alignment, strategically frozen panes. This is how artists, curators, musicians, dancers have been taught into managerial talk. How to make a proposal, how to make a budget, how to write an email, how to prepare a contract, how to be a successful artist, how to be a public speaker, how to prepare a CV, how to light an exhibition, how to hang a painting, how to write labels, how to write an artist bio, how to write an artist statement, how to create a portfolio, how to make your website, how to save money, how to build your network, how to build your net worth, how to market yourself. In contexts where managerialism is dominant, a curator's role has become that of an art administrator for institutions or private patrons, sometimes combined with being a fundraiser. And the artist's role is to churn out proposals. This might perhaps be the biggest co-option of the legacy of conceptual art, far beyond any commercial or museum co-option, that is, to make artists into producers of concept notes and artist statements for grant applications. But of course, no co-option is ever complete, and nothing is ever fully co-opted. Power would only like everyone to believe that it has the capacity to completely co-opt. One wonders why athletes and celebrities have not been coerced into similar forms of managerial practice yet. Maybe because they have their own managers and team managers. Looking at managerial proceduralism. Boiled down, the work of the manager is to quantify capacities. It is the incessantly lifeless work of perpetuating the myth of merit through production of arbitrary thresholds. The work of the manager is to reduce those thresholds into nomenclature of benchmarks and milestones and enforce procedures of requirements, proofs, sanitations, scrutinies, papers that show one number higher than another number, a footfall, a KPI, or a deadline set at 11:59 p.m. on Friday when no one will look at it before Monday. The daily work of the manager is to work on others' work, to chase work. That is the realm of the managerial, not to create, but to reproduce, repeat, and return the next day. There's a creativity boasted about the process of innovating models of further growth, which are a reproduction of the same output achieved on a larger scale through creatively exploitative techniques. When a manager monitors someone's work, they need to demonstrate the work that went into monitoring the said work through a report that shows that the manager is working. As the system expands, it enters into its purest abstraction of a workforce that is producing reports of other people's reports. A work to render work illustrated by bar graphs, pie charts, heat maps, line graphs. Think of a progress report, a collection report, a research report, a report of a report. The legacy of the manager is paperwork, most commonly A4 sheets, 55 to 80 GSM. The manager is the police. The manager does not simply fear life, but is hostile to it, hates it, thinks it is too convoluted, too indeterminate, too uncertain, too unprofessional, too untamed, that is, too alive, and crucially, too risky, that is, too possible, and therefore in a state of excess that needs to be deadened by enumeration. The work of the manager is to render life as in need of Microsoft Excel. The manager excels in being the caretaker of systematized exploitation, or if one may say, of permissible violence. The work of the manager is violence at its most abstracted and naturalized form, with none of the vitality of a storm or even a dare. The manager often wears another name to hide their work. In the 20th and 21st century, the work of the manager, once epitomized in the factory, opens into a genocide, the hedge fund, the sports team. The manager knowingly launders their silhouette, posing as someone who is remotely interested in doing something, anything. The work of anyone remotely interested in being alive is to apprehend the work of the manager at every turn and in every mirror, while simultaneously, crucially, without succumbing to its deadening force. I had a section on the consultant, but I think I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. But the consultant also has become a very prominent figure that I think needs special attention and needs to be looked at very seriously in the cultural field that we're all working in and involved with. And what does this bring about to our conversations on crises? Because the consultant seems to be really at a very important junction in number one, rendering the crisis for you, and then after that, suggesting a problem, and then not being around to finally solve it themselves and have other people solve it. And when they're not able to, because the plan itself was never realistic, then blame it on others. But we're going to be not doing that for now. Let me just jump to another section, the second last section, the router. There is a field of art that is made of milieus comprising of students, artists, writers, curators, researchers, former students, professors, translators, activists, friends of friends, friends that look after another friend's child, supporting one another and supporting art. This milieu churns as a site of production, experimentation, discussion, and refuge. You can see this field appear in exhibition openings, in talks, seminars, and also in protests, open studios, reading circles. It's a milieu of thinkers and practitioners who share, smuggle, and produce plenitude. This field of art is not immune to various social, public, and communitarian moorings. Its practitioners are located within and entrenched in various communitarian dynamics. Then there is the art world that is run by markets, institutions, and a regulation of scarcity. This is the art world that Arthur Danto famously wrote about in his 1964 essay. Danto's main argument was that in the contemporary context, only the community of art professionals associated with its institutions, shaped by late capitalism, can distinguish art from non-art. This art world consists of global supply chains and infrastructures that include museums, galleries, collectors, auction houses, investors, shipping companies, storage facilities, contracts, insurance, project reports, themes, and regional representations. This world thrives on being sealed off from the police. This world thrives on being sealed off from the public and the wider community, keeps itself protected by thick white walls, quiet interiors, and specialized knowledge and exclusivity. And it terms these conditions as a prerequisite for artistic autonomy and an appreciation of art for art's sake. The art world and the art field constantly rub against one another. And there are also, of course, many who move across the tree, short-circuiting, rerouting, smuggling, and transforming the art world. A lot of people often conflate the field of art with the art world, concluding that art is the latter, an elite industry. But it's clear how vastly distinct these two are. If anyone even moderately has any engagement with the field of art, its practitioners, the spaces it occupies, the discourses and urgencies it is producing, and the claims it is making, a lot of the things we take for granted get redefined. A lot of the cliches get redefined, such as who is an artist, who is a curator, who is an intellectual, what is an artwork, and what are the conditions in which art is encountered. Also, what are the conditions in which art is being produced, and what is art then doing? I believe this redefinition is already taking place, right here, right now, by a number of practitioners. The documenter that was curated by Ruang Rupa presented that field of practice with full force and confidence. And you could see that the art world totally lost it. It had no idea how to deal with this field. Even those who were supportive of it would make backhanded compliments that the documenter was more about ethics, not aesthetics, pretty much indicating that aesthetics must mean commodity aesthetics. The practices are really so many that I won't be able to name all of them, but just to share a few. Mohit Shalare, who does these studio visits in his own studio, and now his studio has become, since 2020, a kind of a hub for various kinds of presentations by other artists and exhibitions. Out of Line, that is led by Kaushal Sapre, Asma Tulika, Juana Abbas, Kush Badwar, and various others who have been basically looking at telephonic infrastructure and creating art from there and finding all kinds of junctions. And they presented this in the Foundation for Indian Contemporary Art in Delhi, but basically the project exists in between the networks of communication. The Nepal Picture Library in Kathmandu, the Ding Hai Chao initiative founded by Chen Yun in Shanghai in 2011, the Good School, co-founded by Rang Rupa and others. Pamposh, another initiative that took place at the Foundation for Indian Contemporary Art, looking really at initiatives within a neighborhood. Asia Art Archive and the various collaborations and research that they've been doing, channeling the milieus from various historical costs. Offset projects founded by Anshika Verma, who has been collaborating with photographers and bookmakers in producing photo books. All kinds of zines coming out, such as this one called Restricted Fixations, founded by Renuka Rajiv. Her Pixel Story, founded by Nawal Ali, Ufaq Fatima and Zainab since 2019, who actually started this initiative first and foremost in the military-occupied space of Kashmir, and changing the narrative really of the number of photographers and journalists who are largely men, and these photographers, as part of Her Pixel Story, come forward and start a collective, an initiative to bring women's voices and women's narrative in their own experience. In most of the practices I've just mentioned, what we're talking about is not an event-based model. It is not a festival nor an exhibition. They're not collectives or communes. The role of the artist and curator are not clearly defined. The artists are curators, the curators are researchers, and writers are lecture performers in various permutations and combinations. And the sites for showing their practices are rarely in white cube galleries. Instead, they're in studios, universities, libraries, and reading rooms, a makeshift server, while the exhibitions become a symposia, a reading group, or a space for pedagogy and learning. This is not public art, it's not private art, it's not arte povera, it's not fluxus, it's not community art. I came at close quarters to this facet of the field through 5 Million Incidents that was conceived by Rux Media Collective from 2019 to 2020, and it continued during the pandemic, hosted by the Goethe Institute in New Delhi and Calcutta. There, the practitioners were not participating as artists, but as actants. They were invited to create artworks, not artworks, but incidents. They were not offered an exhibition space, but asked how they would occupy time. The organizers were not art managers, but custodians. There were no curators, but mentors and catalysts. At Ishara, Art Foundation, where I work, I had a similar experience of working with Sohrab Hura, a photographer, an artist who curated Growing Like a Tree in 2 iterations in Delhi, and later handed it over to 2 photographers in Bunudungana in Kathmandu and Sadia Mariam in Dhaka to curate a 3rd iteration in Goa. In 2021, we tried to bring a number of these voices from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka together in an online symposium titled Staging the Contemporary that was organized by the India Art Fair and supported by Shiv Nadar University. Most of the practices I've highlighted must be seen in a moment when interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity have already become marketable symbols. Towards this, the practices I've mentioned so far produce a kind of non-disciplinarity. They're not antagonistic, they're not anti-institutional, anti-disciplinary, nor are they alternative. They're not parallel to the system. They just bypass the classifications that are dominant in the industry of artists, the curator, the artwork, the exhibition, the event, and so on. There is no vanguardism or heroism in these gestures, nor romanticism of art and life. In fact, most of them operate in conditions of a high degree of precariousness among the practitioners, where external resources and funds are limited, sometimes completely absent. We probably need to see these practices as part of a larger aesthetic revolution that's already going on, and that Jacques Rancière described in his book, Disagreement. There's a sense of a nonsense, or the not yet sensible at work. Many of these practices call for a construction of the very form of their visibility. That is, how should they be encountered itself is a question. This is something that Rancière describes around images, calling for a reform of perception. All of these practices call for new forms of artistic, communitarian, and public encounters for which existing models are shaping as we speak. I'm going to end my talk and my paper by reading out the very last section of my presentation today. And this section, section 5, is 101 variations of the exhibition in the 21st century. We need new theoretical frameworks for the exhibition. This is not a call for a new kind of exhibition. That's something already happening because every work imposes new demands on an exhibition. The question is, are we looking at and talking about exhibitions for what they are today? The following, I'll read out some of them, are a series of ongoing variations of exhibitionary thought. These are not taxonomies, nor are they typologies. 1. The exhibition of the 21st century is where site specificity becomes site elasticity. The exhibition of the 21st century is where the ground becomes a rippling surface. The exhibition of the 21st century is where the site is neither an archaeological site to be excavated, nor a tabula rasa to be filled. 4. The exhibition of the 21st century is where the world of analog information collides with the world of digital information. The exhibition of the 21st century is where the white cube itself is an artifact. 6. The exhibition of the 21st century rewrites the meaning of artworks as we speak, with every presentation. The exhibition of the 21st century does not preserve a singular meaning for an artwork. The exhibition of the 21st century approaches art as an unstable category, at once less and more than the art object. The exhibition of the 21st century is where corporations rehearse all their insecurities with insurance policies and risk assessment. The exhibition of the 21st century is an extension of the artist's studio. It changes the chronology where the work was made in the studio and then shown in the exhibition. In most cases now, the work for the first time is created where it is shown, that is in the exhibition. The exhibition of the 21st century is a site for reverse archaeology. It is where the curator does not dig into the depths of the earth to salvage the dead, but the depths erupt out to announce the living. The exhibition of the 21st century is a staging of global supply chains. 13, the exhibition of the 21st century is a site for sharing itineraries, not origins, and certainly not inventories. 14, Sara Ahmed says in Living a Feminist Life that to build feminist dwellings, we need to dismantle what has already been assembled. The exhibition of the 21st century is a disassemblance. The exhibition of the 21st century is where ideas come to pair like Bluetooth devices. 16, the exhibition of the 21st century is where objects become hyperlinks to other objects in the rest of the world. 17, the exhibition of the 21st century is an observatory for the deep present. The exhibition of the 21st century is a stage where unstable objects come to perform. The idea of an object was never stable in the first place. Every era redefines the object. Not only is the image an unstable site, so is an object. The exhibition of the 21st century is where an object moves backwards in time, and that ceases to be science fiction. The exhibition of the 21st century is not an avant-garde space, neither is it a rear-guard space. The exhibition of the 21st century is a scaffolding that does not lead to a building. The exhibition of the 21st century has no fixed jurisdiction. The exhibition of the 21st century is a multi-channel installation to the nth degree in which everything is already a moving assemblage of innumerable channels. There is no one or even two or three or four channels, anything. The exhibition of the 21st century produces new forms of intelligibility in spite of the museological. The exhibition of the 21st century is where ideas escape the circumstances of their conception. The exhibition of the 21st century is not about the flow, it is in the flow. The exhibition of the 21st century has air conditioning. On that note, I end my presentation. Thank you very much. I hope it leads to some good discussions. I'll wait to hear afterwards from UGA if there were any questions. I wish I was there to answer them. This, I know, is somewhat a provocative presentation, but I think me and Lantian, when we were writing our book, we wanted to write it in a way that's not simply about having a polemical stance, but really, if we're going to be talking about this, what is the language? What is the tone in which we're going to discuss this? And what are we going to be reading? What are the new instruments of, I would say, violence and injustices? And therefore, how do we even start talking about them? I hope this presentation contributes to what's already being put on the table. And thank you very much. Take care.
What a presentations, bombastic, daring, and I feel a little bit sad. Museums set out to collect, preserve, research, and conduct exhibitions and public programs with a specific focus on education and learning. And can we say no to museums? Well, Manray, may I ask for your views on that?
Actually, as Ahmed said, he is not trying to be polemic, but I find it quite polemic. Maybe I'm polemic myself. On the one hand, he presents this something called museological, and it is like, okay, now we conceive museum, but what is it? He make it a long list of contrast of what is the museum and what is the alternative. And interestingly, the alternative is called the curatorial. And you know, we are listed as like independent curators. Huh? So basically, according to him, we are good guys.
Well, I think I'm not a good guy as such. I did museum studies and I teach museum studies, and I serve as a museum consultant receiving commissions from the institutions. So I'm not sure I am the good guys.
Okay.Maybe that's what we do. Yeah, actually, we are always in the middle of something. Yeah, I do work with museum, and I also consulting museums, and very often we do curating inside the museum. Yeah, so I would want to do a list of like my reading, and then also my response to to his presentation. Okay. The way I read it, basically, his presentation is a continuous listing of the kind of what we call the binary, a binary opposition, and in the complex of the the state of the museum. Yeah, perhaps. He tried to refer to this kind of high modern American European museums like the Louvre, Tate Museum, and so on. And then thinking that most museums are working in that way, especially the logic behind is more like Friedrich Jameson's the cultural logic of capitalism. And so in a way, he presented a scenario which is quite familiar to us. But then on the other hand, he wants to oppose it to the type of work that he would like to endorse, which is the curatorial type. The curatorial type, as he quote from Yuri Rogov, a curator as the smuggler and so on. Yeah, but I want to add that even in the context of museums, we are not really seeing museums always in that functioning in that way, and I would say such an understanding easily leads us to overlook the multitude of museums worldwide that do not operate according to this binary at all. In fact, the museums I'm familiar with, at least in Taiwan, are a hybrid that exists somewhere between the two extremes and are not fixed or static at all. It reminds me of this film by Leonis, The Good and the Bad and the Ugly. And in a way, I would say most museums are like this mixture, the good and the bad and the ugly. And when I said we are good guys, yeah, we are also a part of the good and the bad and the ugly. And that is the case, I would say, how the museums and the curatorial work is operating right now, and it is difficult, I would say, to be museological in his sense totally. But on the other hand, we also need to pay attention to what he is implying in the back, especially I would say the implication is to put emphasis on the curatorial initiatives that are actually quite widespread outside of the overall museum situation. Okay, back to the Taiwan situation. Since the 1980s, the Taiwanese museums have been undergoing a gradual shift from bureaucratic to professional management, yet they have not experienced a significant neoliberal management turn. And this is quite obvious, and as I said, mentioned already yesterday, in the case of how Asian biennials was on a surge, since the 1980s, and it all has to do with how Asian cities start to build museums where there is no contemporary art collection, there is no professional management in the museum. Instead, we saw a bureaucratic management of the museum, and the big change is through these biennials, slowly museums acquire the ability for professional operation. And in the case of Taiwan, after martial law was lifted in Taiwan, we witnessed a process of transitional justice unfolding within museums. This transformation involved a shift from colonial history to a process of decolonization and reconciliation within the democratic era. And that is also what we see if we say, okay, want to put the museums of Taiwan in the context of democratic movement since the 1980s until now, and that is also what is happening at the moment. And there have been a quest to be in line with the international standards. In Taiwan, we call it 国际接轨, which is, I have to say, a very common quest in many non-Western museums as well. But in the case of Taiwan, we have the lack of international status in the political community. So this quest becomes quite complicated. So the problem is, this anxiety and the need to be part of the international community is understood as international, but the international has been narrowly read as American European standards, and only in the recent years was it changed to include the South, the colonized, the invisible international. So if we are now saying that we still are fighting to be in line with the international and what we call 国际接轨, this quest still need to be continued, but interpreted not narrowly in American European models anymore. So some museums, however, are still in the old quest of former international, such as TFAM. Sorry, I come again to Tiguan. But on the other hand, if we see this 1998 Taipei Biennial work by Cai Guoqiang, Guang Gaoqiang, Steelboard project, it created actually quite a big controversy during that time period. And even the museum budget was threatened to be cut in the city council. If Ahmed is correct, without the existence of binary oppositions, perhaps the most apparent one is that between collections and exhibitions. While collections often reflect market forces, exhibitions frequently engage in more critical and politically charged discourse. The recent surge in interest in exhibition history reflect this shift in perspective, the transformation that museums fear is the possibility of art history becoming exhibition history. And I think that we have already engaged in this debate in former sessions in this conference with the collection which reflects the market force now relegated to mere footnotes rather than the main text of art history. Okay, and the non-Western countries who ended colonial rules within the past 100 years also are brought into post-World War II's globalization, which by itself is another form of colonization. The recent years' localization that took place in many non-Western countries are usually expression of this deep decolonization and the need to be further decolonization. And this is what I mentioned also yesterday already. The reason anti-globalization, or we say like localization, actually is in many cases actually is a reflection of this further decolonization. So what we call localization in the past or in the modernization period of Second World War, usually the modernization is a further expression of decolonization. And then so now when we said we need to localize, actually is to be against that trend of decolonization and bring our local context, our local history into focus in the museums. Next. The decolonization of museums should not simply be understood as a change in artistic expression, rather as ways to include more diverse cosmologies and epistemologies that systematically marginalize in the post-Enlightenment museum practices, which also very common in the non-Western museums. Yeah, because then when we say museums, usually you will include a type of entitled enlightenment in the museum context to exclude the epistemology and cosmology of the South. This is the path Taiwanese museums are currently pursuing. Colonial era museum collections are being returned to their original tribal communities. If not for repatriation, at least these artifacts are being brought back to the tribes, allowing the local indigenous descendants to reconnect with their ancestral heritage. Objects housed in the official museums are no longer solely interpreted through the lens of naturalists, anthropologists. Rather, the original tribes are granted the space to provide their own interpretation based on their collective memory. And this is also a way our national museums in Taiwan actually are doing its own decolonization. And thanks for listening.
Thank you, Manray, for your very thought-provoking responses. I understand that many of us would like to ask Manray about his ideas on decolonizations and the wider museological context, but I'm afraid that we are running out of time. And so if you do have questions, please save it. And right away, we will have our roundtable discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you.